the Cabinet Minister, Employment Minister Stuart Robert. I'll ask you one of the questions the Prime Minister was asked by one of the local journalists there in Lismore. Do you understand why many of the locals there feel abandoned?
Kieran, I was there Friday, so I was the first minister of any government on the ground. As soon as it was opened up, there was myself, obviously Services Australia, and the military. I walked the streets, met everyone, spent the entire day there, hours in the evacuation centre, meeting with police and fireys and emergency services professionals, spent hours with the mayor and talked to as many people, business owners as possible to understand the support they needed. At that stage, disaster recovery payments were flowing, $380 million now in total. Category D funding had been announced, $50,000 for small business, $75,000.
So why do people feel abandoned,
producers and the like? Because the weight of this. Think about Lismore, and Kieran, this is really important. Imagine going to bed with your kids and you know it's going to be 11.5 metres. That's the flood. And then you wake up at 5 a.m. and it's 2.1 metres higher. And an hour after that, the water's up to your neck and you're putting your baby on the roof. Get your head around that. The SES had 7 boats there. Those citizens had a few hours. I mean, the mayor put a call out and 200 tinnies arrived to save thousands of their citizens in an area where everyone went to bed on a Sunday night thinking this will be like the flood we had a few years ago, and awaking to the full horror of what they confronted. Now, if I was one of those families and I went to bed with the best knowledge I had at 11.5 metres and woke up with water up to here and my kids on the ceiling, I'd be pretty upset too. And this is not my story. This is one of the ladies in the evacuation centres. I stood there with the police, with the emergency services. There's 750 people there. These are the stories I was hearing as I walked across the streets and connected with people. Now, the Prime Minister would have come with me on Friday, but he had COVID. The Emergency Management Minister was there on Sunday. So I get it. I feel the horror. Kevin Hogan, the local member, also a member of the executive, has been working his guts out. Geez, I cried with him and his wife too. I get the frustration of these people, Kieran.
Okay,
it's terrible.
But so let me ask you then, because the Prime Minister said that when you get a flood of this sort, you can't have immediate reaction or immediate response, that it's got to be the locals first. Now, given the nature of this emergency, given where it's happened in Northern Rivers, where we know there's been a history of flooding and so on, why weren't there better mechanisms in place to provide the support to people, or at least better than what there was?
Well, if you think about what the Royal Commission into the last bushfires made the point, that the initial response comes locally from the state and the federal government comes helping with emergency payments at the start, following by the Category D, which is the further payment structures, and then we move and we progressively add more and more support as we're allowed to go in there. So the very first thing the federal government did, as roads were open, I went in there as the small business minister to work through on behalf of the federal government, what are the initial requirements, what do we need, what's important here. You'd expect a community to be first in, especially when they had no warning. I mean, what they did was extraordinary, this community.
But given the nature of these sorts of floods, and clearly we're facing more and more of these, the Prime Minister conceded this is a national security risk now, this sort of flood crisis with climate change. He admitted, conceded as much in that news conference. That's where we're heading. How much more do we need in terms of mitigation and to have emergency services there so that people don't have to go around in their dinghies and save babies off roofs?
Well, I think we need to pull out all the stops on this. Chatting with the Mayor, Steve, there was a mitigation report from the previous Greens councillor. He found the bottom drawer that had all of the steps needed to be taken to achieve that mitigation, and that council did nothing. It's why that community threw them out, and Steve is a very popular mayor. And he was talking about what's required, and now, as the Prime Minister said, we're going to pull out all stops. We're all going to work together to achieve the mitigation we need for these communities. It's why we've got the $4 billion fund there, to ensure there are always funds separate from the general expenditure of government that we can draw down on. Minimum $50 billion.
Should the Prime Minister do a street walk?
And more
should he do it? Should he do a street walk as you did when you were there on Friday of last week?
I think the Prime Minister answered that. I walked for hours and met everyone. So did Minister Mackenzie. Now, I didn't have a whole bunch of crazy loony protesters out there led by the Greens candidate for Richmond. So I was able, with no cameras, to meet with and connect with everyone and hear all their stories and work through what's needed. Get on the phone to Minister Dominello and Victorian ministers, get on the phone to Resilience New South Wales and Communities and Justice and get Services Australia resources in and to do a lot of those
They're
things.
Not all
with
loony
Minister Hogan
protesters.
on the ground.
A lot of locals there too want to give him, their view and their response to this crisis. It's not just sort of loony protesters, it's locals too that want to have a word with him. Why doesn't he do a street walk, go and meet them face to face?
Oh, well, I think the question was asked of the Prime Minister, but when you look at some of those placards, Kieran, there are some loony protesters out there amongst them. Now, I had no problem doing a street walk, but again, I didn't have the whole media pack there. I could move quietly and connect with people. I didn't have a whole bunch of demonstrators there trying to do and deal with another issue, however important. It made it a lot easier for me as a senior cabinet minister to connect and understand the issues and feed it back through the National Security and the Expenditure Review Committee process.
Shouldn't he just front up?
Sorry, Kieran, say that again?
Shouldn't he just front up, even with the protesters, even if it is messy, just go and listen to them, and whether it's cameras and it's messy and it's ugly, shouldn't he just show up?
I think the Prime Minister did show up. I think he did meet with a whole range of people. I think the issue you're raising is you didn't meet it with cameras in tow.
Stuart Robert, I appreciate your time as always. Thank you.
Great to talk to you, Kieran.